Welcome to ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm David Austin, and today we have a special guest. It's Dr. David Fitzpatrick, who is the Medical Director of the East-West Medical Research Institute. Welcome, Dr. Fitzpatrick.
Thanks, David. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks. Would you tell us a little bit about the East-West Medical Research Institute and also what's going on there right now?
Okay, I'd be delighted to. So, East-West Medical Research Institute is involved in the phase of medical research which we call clinical trials.
Okay.
So maybe I can explain a little bit about clinical trials and drug development. So most drug development starts from an idea in basic science. Mm-hmm. Most basic science research is funded by the National Institutes of Health.
Okay.
And then it's kind of passed on. If something looks promising, it'll be taken up by a pharmaceutical company.
Okay.
And the reason for that is that they have money to invest in something that they think they can get a return on. The government thinks they're better spending their money doing basic research, and so it's a good system. So there's a stage of research called preclinical, so that's all the stuff done in labs and with experimental animals. If something looks really promising, then it'll go into one of 4 phases of clinical trials. So phase 1 is where you're testing the drug for the first time in humans.
Okay.
So this is a very controlled environment. Not a lot of people are involved in this. And basically you're looking to make sure that the drug's safe. Now, they've done a lot of research before that on whatever the animal model is that mimics a human's response. So they're pretty confident that they're not going to see problems. But they're looking for, you know, what's the appropriate dosage range and things that's not going to cause side effects.
Okay.
Then if that looks good, they'll move on to phase 2. So phase 2 will be more taking people with the actual disease. So a lot of what we do is in the area of diabetes.
Okay.
So for instance, in diabetes, you'd want patients with diabetes, and it's a new diabetes drug, and you think based on all of this other stuff that you've done, that maybe the dose is, say, anywhere from 1 milligram to 100 milligrams.
Okay.
So you would then do a study where you chose, say, 100 milligrams of the dose and 50 and 10 and 1, and you'd see, you know, what looks like the right dose. Then, if everything's looking good there, you've narrowed it down to what the right dose is, you want to go into what's called phase 3 clinical trials. And these are the critical trials where there are thousands of patients enrolled. And there may be 2 doses. And you're comparing these 2 doses against either what we call placebo, dummy pills, or possibly against another drug that's the standard of care, for instance. Okay. And these are what we call pivotal trials. The results of these trials are what goes to the FDA, and the FDA makes a determination: is this an effective drug? Is it safe?
Okay.
Okay.
And at that point, the FDA has looked at the methodology up until that point, making sure that each of these phases was completed to their satisfaction. And
yeah, actually, the FDA is brought in before the trial even starts.
Okay.
So the FDA actually has to agree to the trial.
Oh, all right.
So that's the safeguard. So there are a number of safeguards for people who volunteer for these trials. So one is that the drug company, or if it's a researcher just doing his own thing, which is not likely to happen very often because it usually takes anywhere from $800 million to $1 billion to bring a drug to market.
Okay.
So the drug company would go to the FDA and say, we're proposing this trial, give us your feedback. And the FDA would say, well, we want extra studies done on safety, or we want these other doses studied, or whatever. And so it gets finalized with the FDA's approval.
Okay.
And so the FDA has evolved all the way along in doing that.
Okay.
So what we do at East-West Medical Research Institute is the phase 2 and 3 trials mainly. Okay. Sometimes there's another phase of trials called phase 4. These are studies on drugs that are already approved by the FDA, but maybe maybe it's a blood pressure pill, but we think actually it may have some benefit for people with diabetic kidney disease. Okay. So it's an approved drug. We're looking for a different indication for the use of the drug. Okay. So going back to your question, how did we get involved? Right. So I've always been involved in research. Before I came to Honolulu, I was doing basic research for 4 years at McGill University, and I got very interested in diabetes. I came to Honolulu in 1981, joined Strive Clinic, was there for 10 years, did some smaller research projects there. So I was always interested in research. And then 15 years ago, I was approached by Merck, actually, and they were involved in a study where the main physician involved was the leading kidney specialist at Harvard. And he had a worldwide reputation. And they had developed a study to look at people who had diabetic kidney disease and who would normally go on to end up on dialysis or require a kidney transplant.
In other words, their diabetes would cause renal failure or some other kidney-related disease.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so we were asked if we would like to participate in a trial looking at a blood pressure medicine that was actually on the market to see whether that would delay or even prevent the onset of renal failure. And so I was very excited. I thought that was a very worthwhile research endeavor. So we did it, and it turned out that drug actually worked and is now the standard of care.
Wow.
And is actually it's recommended that every person with type 2 diabetes or type 1 diabetes take this drug. So that was a very gratifying experience for me. And it introduced me, even though I'd done basic research, I really didn't understand the clinical trial situation. So it introduced me, it was a new skill I had to learn. And Merck was very good. They sent out a lot of people to train me.
Right.
And we apparently did a good job because then they said, well, you guys did a really good job. Could you, would you be interested in doing other things? So we did. And basically it's just grown from there. So we've grown from myself and one of my staff doing all of this to now I have 9 full-time employees and a number of part-time employees who help me with doing the research, and we're up to doing about 31 trials right now in different areas.
From different drug companies?
Yeah. We're fortunate. We've got a reputation for doing a good job.
Right.
So half the studies that we do right now are in the area of diabetes.
Okay.
And of those studies, so that's 15 studies, those are with various drug companies who are working on various defects in diabetes to try and develop new treatments.
Okay. What do you mean by defects in diabetes?
Okay, well, type 2 diabetes
Right.
is actually a very complicated disease. And we used to think that it was a problem either with the body not producing enough insulin or the body not responding properly to insulin. Okay. And then we realized, well, it's a problem of not producing enough insulin, and the muscles don't respond properly to the insulin, and the liver doesn't respond properly to the insulin. So then the therapies that were developed were a drug to make your pancreas produce more insulin, a drug to make your muscles respond better, and a drug to make your liver respond better. Okay. Now there are 8 defects identified. Okay. So there's a defect of production of some hormones from the gut. So that when you eat, a signal is sent from your stomach down to these little cells 22 feet away in your small intestine. They produce a hormone. That hormone goes to your pancreas and tells your pancreas, okay, there's food in the stomach, your sugar's going to go up soon, get ready to produce insulin. It goes to the liver, and it tells the liver to do certain things, like don't produce as much sugar baseline because we're going to have an influx of sugar. It tells the stomach to slow down. And most intriguingly, it tells your brain that you better stop eating. You've got food. And we actually, there is a drug that has now been developed. And it's on the market. Actually, there's 2 drugs now. And we were actually involved in the development of both of these drugs in the past that will not only improve patients' blood sugars, but they actually can help them lose weight because they don't feel hungry. So that's another exciting drug. And we're actually working on other treatments that work on that system.
And what other treatments are you working on?
Well, we're going back to the first drug available for diabetes was insulin. And there have been a lot of improvements since we just had, insulin made from pig and beef pancreas. To now we have genetically engineered human insulins. So that allows us to change the insulin molecule to work in different ways. So we're working on some new insulins that work in a better fashion than the ones that are available now. So that's one area. Excuse me. we're, as I said, this gut hormone that's defective, we're working on some better treatments than are currently available to try and improve that part of the system. Those treatments are both injections, so they've got some negatives to them, obviously.
Right.
So it's possible to, that particular hormone that comes from the gut is destroyed in the blood by an enzyme very quickly.
Okay.
And we're working on treatments that lower the level of the enzyme so that the natural hormone rises. So, and that's a pill, so that's an attractive treatment. Other areas that we're working on are, I told you about how we were involved in that treatment for diabetic kidney disease.
Yes.
So that's the standard of care, but there are still some people who don't respond.
Okay, I see.
Yeah. So we're looking at people who don't respond, and we're looking at other treatments that we can add on to the first treatment to see if that helps.
I see.
So it's almost a repetition of the study we did 15 years ago, but with a new treatment.
I see.
Okay, just to try and get more people with diabetes who will not go on to get kidney failure.
Okay, that's very interesting.
Some of the other areas that we're working on, we have studies. We're actually doing another study for people who have renal insufficiency from diabetes, taking another approach to try and prevent their kidney problems.
How does diabetes affect the kidney? Why does it cause renal failure, renal insufficiency?
Yeah, so diabetic complications can be divided into two.
Okay.
One group is problems that are caused by damage to very small microscopic blood vessels.
Okay.
And those blood vessels are in the eyes, the kidneys, and the nerves.
Okay.
Okay. So those problems are caused purely by high blood sugar.
Okay. And this is where you hear about diabetics going blind, for example.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's the same lesion. So if somebody's going blind from diabetes, they almost certainly also have diabetic kidney problems.
I see. Okay.
And so that's related to blood sugar, and those problems are preventable by controlling the blood sugar. And that's why we're trying to develop better insulins and better treatments, right? The other set of problems are problems that are not specific to diabetes because they're problems of damage to big blood vessels.
Okay.
So those would be your coronary arteries, the arteries going to your brain, the arteries going down your legs.
Okay.
Okay. So everybody's heard about people having amputations because of diabetes.
Right.
Well, one of the reasons would be the blood vessels get blocked.
Okay.
But they can get blocked for other reasons, cigarette smokers, things like that. Same with heart attack, strokes. So they're not specific to diabetes, excuse me, but they occur a lot more frequently.
Okay.
And so we are looking at how can we control those problems. And that's a combination of controlling the blood sugar, but also controlling the other, what we call risk factors.
Okay.
The other risk factors are having high cholesterol.
Right.
So the goal for a diabetic patient, for instance, is more aggressive than it would be for somebody who didn't have any risk factors. Blood pressure control, and a number of other things. Cigarette smoking, of course, is just deadly if you're diabetic.
And diet, of course, plays a role in all of this too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But if diet were easy, there'd be nobody overweight in the world.
Exactly.
So that's a problem.
Do you find that people in Hawaii particularly pose any significant challenges to diabetes treatments? Do you think, for example, like the diet that people eat here is particularly better or worse than other places, or?
I don't think it's any worse than a lot of places. Certainly the plate lunch is one big problem, not only for diabetes, but cholesterol, and it's loaded with salt, so it raises your blood pressure. So if there were one meal we could get rid of in Hawaii that would improve our health, it would be the plate lunch.
I think there'd be a lot of protest, but yeah.
That's right, and that's the problem. So that's a hard thing. So diet's something we work on with patients. It's the fundamental thing. But it's also the most difficult thing.
Right?
Yeah.
Because it's actually a lifestyle change as opposed to changing a drug therapy that you're using, right?
Yeah. And so when you tell patients, well, we've got a treatment that can help you lose weight, their eyes do widen. And they say, tell me more about it.
Right. What other trials are you involved with aside from diabetes?
Well, we've got studies actually where we're looking to actually prevent diabetes.
Oh, really? Okay.
So with blood sugars, the definition of diabetes is a blood sugar of 126 or greater when you're fasting. But the normal blood sugar is 65 to 99. So there's a gap.
Right.
between what's normal and what's diabetes.
Right.
So we have a few little fine print things, but this is basically called impaired glucose tolerance.
Okay.
Okay. So what we're doing is looking at people with impaired glucose tolerance and seeing whether we can actually apply some treatments that are available now, not only actually for diabetes, but there are blood pressure medications that actually reduce insulin resistance.
Okay.
And so we're actually looking to see whether if somebody used that particular blood pressure pill as opposed to another one which we know doesn't affect insulin resistance,
Right.
would that decrease their chance of getting diabetes?
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and that's the ultimate treatment for diabetes is don't get it.
Is right, exactly, is
Yeah.
preventing it before it actually happens.
Right. So another area that we've done a lot of research on is gout. And gout is amazingly common in Hawaii for a couple of reasons. Plate lunches are another
Right,
reason
right.
for it. Luau's are another reason, okay? And actually, if you're Filipino, Filipinos frequently have a genetic abnormality where they don't get rid of uric acid, which is what causes gout, as easily from the body as Caucasians do. So they're an ethnic group that's more likely to get gout.
And gout is a buildup of uric acid in your foot, right?
Well, it's a buildup of uric acid in a joint.
In a joint,
Yeah.
okay.
So the joint just between your foot and your first big toe is the one that is the typical kind
Interesting,
of
okay.
place you get it.
Okay.
And I've treated gout for years, but when we did this study, I was just amazed at how many people were having gout. The people who volunteer for the study
Right.
are the ones who get a lot of gout and their current treatment's not working. And we'd have people who are getting gout attacks for twice a month, and they can't
Wow.
walk for a couple of days
Right.
because it's so painful.
It's so painful.
Yeah, but gout can also affect any joint almost, and it also predisposes to kidney stones as well.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we've done research on new treatments for gout because
Okay.
the current treatments leave something to be desired.
What are the current treatments for gout?
So uric acid is produced by the body. It's
Okay.
a natural byproduct of the metabolic processes, and then it is excreted through the urine.
Okay.
So you can divide people with gout into two groups. One, overproducers,
Okay.
and two, under-excreters.
Okay.
Okay?
That makes sense.
So the two classes of main classes of drugs are to address overproduction. So those drugs work on the liver to reduce uric acid production, and then the other ones increase excretion of uric acid from the kidneys.
Okay.
So one of the things that we worked on and is now again on the market is a drug that works on the overproduction,
Okay.
and it will lower the uric acid more
Okay.
than the previous treatment would.
Okay.
And that previous treatment had some serious side effects, and we think that this would have less side effects.
Okay.
So that's why that was developed. Now we're actually looking at people who have kidney stones, in which the over-excretion of uric acid is playing a role.
Okay.
And we're seeing whether there's a treatment to dissolve the kidney stones.
Interesting.
Yeah. So that's kind of our interest in gout, and I was interested in it because it's a metabolic process, but I'm now
Right.
even more interested because I realize there's just a lot of gout in the islands.
Right. That's interesting. That's
Yeah.
very interesting. Is there an endocrine process that's involved with gout, or is it?
Well, okay, my field is endocrinology and metabolism.
Right,
So
okay.
it's
a metabolic
It's a
thing.
metabolic
Okay, it's a
problem.
metabolic issue.
Yeah. So you want to hear about more studies?
Absolutely, please.
Okay. So osteoarthritis
Okay.
is another area that we've got into. This is not really related to endocrinology, but we fortunately had just become good at doing these trials. So
Okay.
we started to be approached, would you be interested in doing research on this? And so osteoarthritis, as you know, is an enormous problem.
Right.
It's getting more common as we all live longer. And currently, basically, you're dealing with trying to prevent pain so you can function,
Right.
or having a joint replacement. So
Okay.
let's say it's your knee, okay? So you start out with a few twinges, and maybe you take some Tylenol or aspirin or some Advil now and again, and you're okay.
Right.
And then the next thing you know is, you're having a hard time going downstairs. So
Right,
you take
right.
the elevator, which
Right.
makes you get heavier. And
Right.
so it starts limiting your lifestyle. So you're talking about pain control. Then people start taking these drugs every day, and then they have to move on to something stronger. And they're
Okay.
either narcotics or narcotic-like drugs, and they've got obvious side effects.
Right.
Constipation,
Right.
impairing your thinking, addiction.
Right,
So
addiction,
that's
sure.
that's not good. And then either people don't want to do that, or they do it for a while, and then they end up with a knee replacement.
Okay.
Now, if you're a youngish person and you've got osteoarthritis, those knee replacements don't necessarily last forever, so you don't want to be having a knee replacement when you're 50,
Right.
thinking you're going to need another one when you're in your 70s.
Right.
So we've got two areas of research that we're looking at. One is to look into drugs that are not narcotics
Okay.
that can provide pain relief for people where taking Advil or Aleve doesn't work anymore. Okay, and then we've got an area where we're looking into actually arresting or actually reversing the degenerative process.
Okay, because it's degeneration, not necessarily a swelling between the joints, but it's that what's between the joints has degenerated and fallen apart.
So there's two bones like this, and
Okay.
each bone is lined with cartilage.
Okay.
So when it moves, it's a nice smooth, it's like Teflon, right? So it moves nicely. And with time, that gets worn away. Maybe we're an athlete and we tore a cartilage, and that
Right.
predisposes us to getting osteoarthritis. So the end stage of osteoarthritis of the knees is just bone on bone, and you can feel them grinding,
Yeah,
and it's very painful.
Yeah.
So what we have looked at is, if somebody's got reduced cartilage but still got some, is there a way to actually stimulate cartilage growth, which obviously would be very desirable.
Right.
So that's another area that we're interested in. Other areas, we've done some studies with fibromyalgia. Fibromyalgia, for your viewers that may not be familiar with it, is where you just have a lot of pain all over your body. And there are certain trigger points, frequently on the back or the arms, that really cause a lot of pain. People have trouble sleeping. It just could be a debilitating illness.
Because I've heard that fibromyalgia isn't necessarily a disease or disorder that you can test for in terms of like running a blood test, but it's almost like a constellation of symptoms that you have. And is it true? I don't know how you'd respond to something like this, but some people believe that fibromyalgia isn't really a disorder. I would like to definitely hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so that's good. So it's now, those were all arguments in the past. Some people felt it was primarily a sleep disorder, and people didn't, the first thing that happened is people got insomnia, and because of that, their body's tired and they ate like crazy, which happens to all of us if we don't get enough sleep. It's now been shown that people with fibromyalgia have certain abnormalities of their pain pathways from the spinal cord going up to the brain.
Interesting.
And what that discovery has allowed us to do is focus on some of the chemicals, neurotransmitters in those pain pathways, and look for drugs that can affect them. And we've done some studies with drugs that do exactly that. And as with a lot of drugs, some people respond really well and some people don't do as well. And that's probably because it's a lot more complicated than I just told you.
Right.
So,
and what sort of treatments are out there now for people with fibromyalgia? If I was diagnosed with it, what would I do to alleviate the symptoms?
Yeah, so your physician would diagnose it. As you said, there's not a specific test, so it's a constellation of symptoms. So he makes the diagnosis. And probably one of the most popular drugs is a drug called Neurontin, which was developed as an anti-seizure medicine. And it's been used for a lot of different indications. So a lot of people get some benefit from that. There are some antidepressant drugs, some of the older antidepressant drugs are used, and there's a lot of other things. When there's a lot of possible treatments for a disease, it means none of them probably work very well. So some people get relief, but a lot don't. So that's why we're still looking for something.
That's interesting that an antidepressant would work on a disease like fibromyalgia. As you know, I know that for example, the treatment that they use to get people to quit smoking was tried as an antidepressant. Is that right? The
That's
Wellbutrin is what it's
right.
called?
That's right. And the reason for that is that the antidepressants affect neurotransmitters. So they affect. That's how they affect mood, but they also affect pain perception.
Okay.
So going back to diabetes, a lot of diabetic patients have nerve damage, which is painful. So they can't. They have a lot of pain. They can't sleep at night because of the pain. So we usually actually give them an antidepressant, and that can help. Or we actually use Neurontin as well, because that affects certain of the chemicals that transmit pain all the way up the spinal cord to the brain.
That's interesting. Could you? I don't know if we've been over the difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes.
Okay, So type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is due to a lack of insulin production from the pancreas.
Okay.
It's what we call an autoimmune condition.
Okay.
So patients with type 1 diabetes, usually children but not exclusively, have inherited a certain kind of immune system. So it's genetically predetermined that you're going to be at risk for diabetes. Doesn't mean you'll get it. Something comes along, triggers the immune system to not recognize the insulin-producing cells in the pancreas and the islets of Langerhans.
Okay.
And so there is this usually pretty rapid, but it can be a slow process, destruction of the insulin-producing cells. The blood sugar rises rapidly. Patients lose weight, urinate a lot, and frequently end up in the hospital. Okay, so that's type 1 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is a lot more complicated than that, and that is where there are multiple defects. That's the 8 defects I told you about.
Okay.
So there's a lot of debate in endocrine circles about what comes first. But basically you've got insulin resistance, which precedes the onset of the diabetes probably for 10 or more years.
Okay.
So if you measure insulin levels in these people, they have high insulin levels.
It's a warning.
It's a warning, right. And so the high insulin level overcomes and keeps the blood sugar under control for a while, but then the insulin's producing cells poop out.
Okay.
You know, it's like going up a hill forever with your foot on the accelerator.
Right,
okay.
right.
And those are the people who have, so they have an insulin deficiency. They also have been identified to have some of the defects I've told you about before. And the latest thing is they've been found to have a defect in the appetite center of the brain, where because they're insulin resistant, the high insulin levels don't shut off the appetite like it would in a normal person. And so they keep eating.
Interesting.
Which contributes to being overweight.
Right.
And so that's another area where people are starting to look, now how can we change that?
Right.
And that would be a good way to change. So the common denominator is the blood sugar is elevated in both conditions, but totally different diseases from an etiological point of view. Type 1 diabetes, I might mention, we're part of a consortium that's funded by the NIH called TrialNet, and we're the people in Hawaii who are part of that study. And the idea there is that there are interventions being developed that can interfere with that immune response.
Okay.
So the idea is to catch people early and right in the first few weeks of getting diabetes, give them something that shuts off the production of these antibodies that are attacking the pancreas.
Interesting.
So the strategy on this research is to have a nationwide network of physicians who do research and to identify relatives of people with type 1 diabetes, test them, test their genes, test their blood sugar, their insulin, and identify who's at risk and who's not. Okay. And then we have a database. Okay. And then we can, if somebody's really at high risk, we can monitor them, which is a value to the patient. Right. And then if something comes along and it's looks like a promising treatment, and any of those people develop diabetes, they'd be eligible to get right in the study. Because we need to know about it right away. Right. So actually, if anybody's watching and they got a relative with type 1 diabetes, they can call us and it's a totally free test. They come in, they get a blood test, and we can tell them whether, yes, you're not at risk of diabetes, or yes, you do seem to be at increased risk and you should get more tests done.
Interesting. So, that leads into an interesting question, which is how does one get involved with your clinical trials?
Sometimes they're my patients. I practice.
Okay.
I have a full-time practice, so I might see somebody, for instance, with kidney problems that didn't respond to the treatment that we do, and say, "Well, we're doing a trial. Would you be interested?" And we tell them the pros and cons. Right. Sometimes we'll have an ad. We'll put an ad in the paper and say, "We're doing a study for gout." Okay. And if you're interested, call us. Sometimes we just have people who've been in trials with us before, and they found it to be a very positive experience, and they say, if you ever have a trial for this, and then there's word of mouth. With the gout studies, I mean, a lot of these guys who had been walking around, having attacks every 2 weeks, were telling all their friends who were going to the same lunch place, or the guys at the same luau, and so they call up and say, "How do we get involved in this?" So there's different ways, and then you might wonder, well, why would anybody want to do a trial?
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So people do it for a lot of different reasons. I would say that some people do it for altruistic reasons.
Okay.
So they just think that they realize that if nobody volunteers for a study, there'll be no new drugs developed, because
that's very interesting.
Every drug that anybody takes, somebody volunteered. Thousands and thousands of people volunteered. Other people do it because they've got a medical condition, and maybe it's not being well controlled, and they're looking for a new treatment or a different approach. I'd say that's probably I'd say the biggest group has a combination of they've got a disease, they're looking for something better, and they're altruistic. They realize that, hey, I might benefit, but if I don't. Typically what people tell me, well, I might benefit, but if I don't, at least it might benefit my kids or other people later on.
I see other people who have the same disease as I do.
Right.
That's interesting.
Just to tell you what the experience is like. Yeah. So, people come in and we explain the whole thing, and we do some tests to make sure that they qualify. We actually not uncommonly pick up other conditions that we tell them about, because the testing is very thorough and much more than most insurance companies would ever pay for.
Right.
If they qualify, then they go ahead and they get the medication. We actually reimburse them for their. We don't give people a lot of money, because we're very careful that we're not offering financial incentives. But they spend quite a bit of time with us, so we might give them $25, $50 each time to cover the cost of transportation.
I see. So some small stipend.
That's right.
But this is all volunteers. I mean, this is truly volunteers.
These are really volunteers. That's right.
That's interesting.
We do, if it wasn't for that, there'd be no new drugs.
Right.
Yeah. The diabetes trials are particularly interesting because the studies show that if you volunteer in a clinical trial for diabetes, it doesn't matter whether you get active drug or a dummy drug, you get better.
Really?
Now, and that is actually a problem in the design, because you have to take that into account. Well, then if the dummy drug works, how do we tell the other one's really working? So the reason that people get better is that they come in and we kind of review the basics with them of diet, and a lot of people don't watch their diet well. They drink juice or the mangoes or things like that. So they get education. But they also pay a lot more attention to their disease, and we're monitoring them and we're giving them feedback. And that works really well. Now, it doesn't work in real life because, the insurance company wouldn't like us to be seeing every diabetic on the island every month and telling them all this stuff. Right,
it's a cost-ineffective model for an insurance company, but it seems to produce tremendously good. If we were able to finance that level of preventative care, preventative medicine would be terrific,
Yeah, then the question is cost-effectiveness.
Right, exactly.
But in the clinical trial situation, most people get better, they like being in the trial. And then it's our job to analyze, did they get better, more better on the drug than just on the placebo. And we have to design those trials a little bit differently to take into, we have kind of a running periods and try and get more baseline information to see what effect our advice and things is having before we start analyzing data later on.
I see. Okay, so you look and see if, for example, behavior modification may be the reason why the person is doing better, as opposed to the drug being introduced.
So that's built into the design of the trial now.
What are the benefits and disadvantages of running clinical trials in Hawaii?
That's a good question. When I started, it was difficult because there are, number one, not a lot of trained clinical trial professionals.
Okay.
So when I first started, I realized that I was having a hard time finding somebody to help me. So we decided that what we needed to do is come up with a strategy to train people ourselves.
Okay.
Okay. So we kind of came up with a profile of who would be the best candidate to be trained as a clinical trial professional.
Okay.
And what we found over the years is the ideal candidate is somebody who has a science background. So they have to have a Bachelor of Science degree.
Okay.
And they basically have to get through the interview process. And the interview process is to find somebody who has integrity, honesty. They have to have people skills because they're dealing with patients.
Right.
Okay. And they have to work well in a team because we all work together.
Right.
Okay. So I had a good friend who was, Hugh Pingree was the president of First Hawaiian Bank, and I met him because I was involved in the Diabetes Association. He used to tell me, and I always remembered this, that he would prefer to hire a liberal arts major rather than a finance major because he wanted good substrate and he could teach anybody finance.
Right.
And I always remembered that, and I said, you know, I want people who've got all of these personal characteristics.
Right.
They've got the analytical mind that they developed during a Bachelor of Science degree, and we can train, we can do the rest. And that model's worked out. So that was difficult to come up with that model, but we did it. Another problem is we compete for clinical trials based on a budget.
Okay.
Okay. And, you know, we have our costs, and then we charge some overhead, which we need for equipment, things like that. And then we have to pay general excise tax.
Right.
Which is, what, 4.5% plus whatever.
Yeah.
And nowhere else in the country does that. So when we're negotiating a budget, people say, what's this extra 4-point-something%? And they generally don't want to pay it.
Right.
So that means we have less money to reinvest and grow.
I see.
So that's an issue, I think, for clinical trials in Hawaii. And then the final issue is actually not many people do clinical trials in Hawaii.
Yeah.
So it would be good for more people to offer clinical trials. Number one, to have the latest treatments available to people. And also, it would build up the number of people who had experiences as assistants, we call them clinical research coordinators. And it also would be more attractive for the drug companies to come to Hawaii.
Right.
Because they have to send representatives over here, what we call monitors. They have to check on the research and send reports back, and the FDA gets a copy of these things. So, one reason that one of our barriers to success was persuading companies that it was worth spending all the money to fly to Hawaii and the time that they have to pay people traveling.
Right.
So if more people were doing it, they would end up locating somebody in Hawaii.
Be much more cost effective.
It would be much more cost effective, right. And we've got, with certain companies, we've done a lot of research, and they've found that they can justify having somebody in Hawaii. But if every company had a representative in Hawaii, then the whole industry in Hawaii would take off.
Right.
And it's a good source of job growth. I mean, we have 9 full-time and 4 part-time employees. Well, actually more than that, but just 4 dedicated part-time employees, and then other people who answer phones and things like that. So it's certainly, we've created jobs. So I think that's an area that the business community could look, or the legislature could look at supporting.
Absolutely. How many other physicians in town do you know of that do clinical trials? I mean, is it under 10, do you think, or is it?
I think there are. It's to some degree of clinical trials, maybe between 10 and 20.
Okay.
Most of them might do 1 or 2 small trials at a time.
Okay.
Phase 1 trials, there's a company called Covance, which is a nationwide company, and they do phase 1 trials. Phase 1 trials are usually done in very discrete locations, so there might be only 10 places in the world that Covance does them, and they chose to have one site in Hawaii. So they're located down at Restaurant Row. Okay. And so they're phase 1. And there's another company called Hawaii Clinical Research Center that does both phase 1 and some late phase research trials. I'm sure there are physicians at the university who are involved in some trials. Queen's Medical Center does a lot of clinical trials. I think they, particularly in the area of neuroscience.
Okay.
So that's an exciting area. And Capilani Hospital does clinical trials.
Okay.
So I think those are I may have left somebody out, and if I have, I apologize, but those are the major players, I think.
Could you talk a little bit more about the clinical research industry and how remarkable it is that we have such things here in Hawaii?
Well, it's an enormous industry. It's, I think last year there was $35 billion spent on clinical trials. There are over 16,000 clinical trials taking place in the United States. So actually, I guess if you figured how big our state is, we're very underrepresented in clinical trials. And I think with the aging population, it's only going to grow. I think it is a big growth area for Hawaii. It's a big opportunity.
So how are clinical trials funded? Could you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, most of them are funded by pharmaceutical companies.
Okay.
Okay. Sometimes by the government.
Okay.
But as I said, the model is to have the pharmaceutical companies take capital that investors, and use that to try and develop these drugs. Biotech companies are actually getting into this a lot now. So the model for pharmaceutical companies is changing a little. So now a lot of the early risk, which is very risky in going from scratch to developing a promising drug, starts with biotech companies. And so they've got the expertise to develop a promising drug, but they don't have the expertise to do the clinical trials.
I see.
So they'll typically partner with, they'll sell their idea to a pharmaceutical company that has that experience, and then there's this partnership between two companies. And we've got some biotech companies here that are trying to do that, right? And Hawaii Biotech, for instance, and they're, I think, are in clinical trials with their dengue fever vaccine and maybe some other things, right?
Because you would think that Hawaii would have particular appeal for drug companies because they would want to study the effects of these drugs. Because I know that certain diseases affect different ethnic groups in different ways. And you would think that Hawaii would have a tremendous appeal because drug companies would be able to study the effects of these drugs on, say, for example, an Asian population or on people of Samoan descent or something like that.
Right. And there's a mandate from the FDA that more minorities have to be included in clinical trials, because it always used to be done in white Caucasian men. So
right.
The complaint was, well, that's great for white Caucasian men, but what for the rest of us?
Right. How is it going to affect
and women,
right.
things like that.
Exactly.
So that actually is an attraction of doing trials in Hawaii. Another attraction is to do what are called Japanese bridging studies, which we've done some of those. So a Japanese bridging study, let me tell you a little bit about that. The background is that the Japanese government has said that they will accept new drug applications done outside of Japan on purely Japanese populations.
That's fascinating.
And so it turns out that we do clinical trials in the U.S. much more efficiently than they get done in Hawaii, in Japan. So we have been approached to do some of these Japanese bridging trials. So,
and especially in Hawaii with such a high Japanese American population and people that can trace their roots directly back to Japan, it seems like fertile ground for growth.
Yeah. So we actually did a trial on a blood glucose meter for the Japanese market, for instance.
Interesting.
And it was us and I think one or two other places in California. And that was an interesting study because you had a meter that was designed that would be accepted by the Japanese. So everything on the meter, all the instructions were in Japanese, of course, right? And we had to find patients with diabetes who were pure Japanese, who also spoke Japanese, and we had to instruct them how to use the meter in Japanese.
Interesting.
So everything was mimicking Japan.
Right.
And so that was a lot of fun. And turns out the Japanese, when they have instructions, they like these little characters, the avatars.
Oh, interesting.
So the design on the meter had all these little avatars running around showing them how to check their blood sugar.
That's terrific.
Yeah, so that was a fun thing. And then we've done we've done other studies with drugs that have been on the market here, and they're trying to get them into the Japanese market, and so we do that kind of testing with Japanese patients.
And what are some examples of those drugs?
Blood pressure drugs.
Blood pressure, okay.
Yeah. That's the main area that we've looked at with that, yeah.
Are there any particular diseases or disorders that are more prevalent in Asian populations or in specifically Japanese populations?
Yeah, there's a lot. There are thyroid problems.
Okay.
So the commonest, an underactive thyroid is very common.
Right.
And it's caused by a disease called Hashimoto's thyroiditis.
Okay.
And it's called Hashimoto's thyroiditis because Dr. Hashimoto discovered it before Dr. Smith. So it's not called Smith thyroiditis.
Right.
And the reason Dr. Hashimoto discovered it first, because there's a lot of it in Japan.
Interesting.
There's a lot of it everywhere, but so there's Japanese patients get more Hashimoto's thyroiditis. Filipino patients in Hawaii actually have the highest incidence of thyroid cancer in the world.
Interesting.
And actually the rate of thyroid cancer in Filipino women living in Hawaii is twice the rate of thyroid cancer of Filipino women living in the Philippines.
That's so interesting.
And that whole thing is very interesting. It's the next highest incidence of thyroid cancer is in Iceland. So then you're going to say, well, so what's the common things between Hawaii and Iceland?
Right.
Well, the first thing that most people would think of, well, it must be the iodine is important in thyroid metabolism.
Right.
So maybe it's because we eat a lot more seafood here and we get more iodine in our diet. You know, and Iceland would as well because it's an island, right? Right. So somebody actually at the Cancer Research Center, which by the way does a lot of clinical trials on cancer research, which I forgot to mention. So somebody at the Cancer Research Center a long time ago looked at this and actually did food diaries from people in Hawaii and LA and found absolutely no difference in the iodine content, much to our chagrin.
Yeah, right.
So then the next thing is what else is common between Hawaii and Iceland? Well, they're both volcanic.
Huh.
So, and you know, volcanoes emit radiation.
Right.
And the radiation we know is associated with cancer.
Right.
So maybe that's a connection, but you know, we don't know. So that's just theory. So that's another interesting disease. I already talked about gout being a lot more common in Filipinos.
Right.
There's actually a condition called periodic paralysis, which happens where people suddenly get paralyzed, and it turns out they've got an overactive thyroid gland.
Interesting.
And that occurs a lot more often in Guamanians and Filipinos than it does in Caucasians. So, for instance, I go to a conference that the Mayo Clinic puts on once in a while, and you sit around and we chat to everybody, and where you know people will say, well, you know, have you ever seen a case of periodic paralysis? And maybe people have seen one or two or whatever. Right. And I said, well, you know, I see that routine. Living in Hawaii. Right. So Hawaii is a very interesting place to practice medicine. There's a lot of different manifestations of diseases. Diabetes itself. So in the Chinese population, for instance, Chinese people generally are thinner. So what I noticed when I first came here is that a lot of my Chinese patients weren't that overweight, but they look like they got type 2 diabetes. Huh. And it's been realized now that if the ideal weight for a Caucasian would be to have what we call a body mass index between 19 and 25. And the higher you get above 25, the fatter you are and the more likely you are to get diabetes and gallstones and all those things. So it turns out that if you're of Chinese ethnicity, the ideal body mass index is below 23, and your chance of getting disease goes up the further above 23 you get. So Chinese patients naturally are skinnier and get diseases from that point on. So a lot of really interesting different manifestations, which makes us a natural laboratory and actually a researcher's paradise, because you can look at all those things.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it sounds like a tremendous incentive. If you could speak directly to the legislature and say, I want you to do something to help clinical research here in Hawaii, what would it be? What do you think is our greatest obstacle? Aside from the GET, what do you think is our greatest obstacle to bringing more business and getting more jobs here in Hawaii based on clinical research?
I think it would be. I think it would be maybe facilitating. Maybe there needs to be a working group that addresses this, but it would be training. So maybe there could be training programs or something at the university or the community colleges where people could be trained in clinical research as a career. The GET is a big one.
Right,
So,
right. It's a
because
huge problem.
yeah,
right.
that's a lot of money you're putting back. It's a big percentage of any profit, that you can reinvest. So the typical overhead on one of these studies would be maybe 20%. So if 4.7 something is going to GET, you just lost 25% of what you've got to use.
To work with. So, so that is a big...
That is a big problem.
A big problem there.
So,
what sort of collaboration do you have with mainland facilities? I mean, do you work with other clinical studies on the mainland when you're doing these trials? And
yeah, we're typically part of what we do what are called multi-center studies. So there typically might be 50 physicians across the country. We call them investigators.
Okay.
There might be 100 if it's an enormous study. We generally will collect samples and send them to the mainland, so they're all analyzed in a central laboratory.
Okay.
But we have other collaborations here with, for instance, if people need X-rays, we've set up collaborations with X-ray sites to do things according to very strict specifications. So we work with them and make sure things are done just right so they can be interpreted properly.
And what sort of role do emerging technologies play in your research? I mean, are you communicating differently now in your clinical studies than you did before? Are you sharing data differently?
Yeah, it used to be all paper-based.
Right.
Now we get the data, and in most of the studies we do, we enter that, we get on the web, we have a secure access, and we input the data directly to a central computer, which facilitates the analysis of the data. It doesn't make it makes it a lot more efficient.
Right.
It cuts down on transcription errors.
Right.
And it makes the analysis of the data much more rapid.
Right.
One of the old way of looking at doing a study was you design a study, you do it, you analyze the data, and you figure out what to do with the next study. Now they're starting to look at studies that are moving as you collect data, and you kind of can redesign the study midway if it looks like there are certain trends. From our perspective, what we've done is we've got high-speed lines. We've upgraded so we can, in our office, we have, faxes come directly to our computers.
Right,
so,
right.
Things like that. We email, obviously, we send things back and forth. 50-page research protocols are just attachments now instead of by mail. So we've spent a lot of money actually doing those things because time is of the essence.
Right,
okay?
right.
So it costs $800 million to $1 billion to develop a drug. It's quoted that every day lost is another $1 million lost.
Interesting.
So there's a lot of emphasis on let's get these things done quickly and communicate directly.
And with the advent of technology, I mean, we no longer a drug company would no longer be able to say that physical proximity is an issue with clinical trials in Hawaii, right?
The only issue is the fact that they have to send people to Hawaii, and it takes time,
and
there's cost, and they think that hotels here are more expensive, and we try to tell them, well, if somebody's if you're sending somebody from LA to Fargo, it probably takes even longer than jumping on a flight to Honolulu.
Right.
We have contracts with some of the hotels to get discounts. So we've done everything we could to get rid of those barriers, so they can't say, well, that's a problem.
Right.
But it still is. One drug company approached me and wanted me to do a study, and then said, oh, we've decided we're not going to do this anywhere west of the Mississippi.
Interesting.
Because for cost reasons, a European company, they just didn't want to travel.
They didn't want to travel from Europe to the West Coast or further.
Right.
Are there a lot of foreign companies that are doing clinical trials? I mean, you had mentioned Japan. I mean, is there any place in Asia that does clinical trials or has a system like the FDA?
There's a big growth in doing clinical trials in India.
Okay.
And a lot of U.S. companies will actually do part of their clinical trials in India. Okay. The next big area is going to be China.
Right, of course.
And drug companies are already starting to set up facilities there. a lot of studies done in Mexico, in Europe, South America, all over the world.
Would they be testing, though, for American markets, or would they be testing for their native market?
So, both. So sometimes some of the studies we're involved in, there may be somebody in Russia as one of the investigators.
Right.
It really depends on the study. Yeah.
So what do you see going on at the Institute over the next year?
We are going to continue to do a lot of diabetes studies. One of the studies we just started up is for Alzheimer's disease.
Interesting.
Which
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, it's for people that are already taking Aricept,
Okay.
and we're adding on something that we think would be beneficial. So that's obviously a very exciting area. We're going to be starting some more studies with different kinds of insulin.
Okay.
Different kinds of drugs for diabetes. We've got one that actually makes sugar come out of the urine. And so instead of being held in the body, it comes out in the urine. And so people, not only does it lower the blood sugar, it lowers their weight because they're losing calories, and it actually seems to lower the blood pressure. So we're looking to see whether those are preliminary observations, so we need to confirm those. So that would be another tool in our armamentarium. We're doing more studies with arthritis and kidney stones.
Terrific.
So those are the main focuses right now.
Great. Well, thank you very much for coming by. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thanks,
Okay,
David.
thank you.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Okay.